In the high reaches of the Bitterroot Mountains, where men vanish and rumors grow wild, a broken mountain man pointed his calloused finger at the girl nobody wanted and declared, "She'll birth me a dynasty." The townsfolk scoffed. She was too plain, too quiet, too strange. But what did he see in her sorrowful eyes and trembling hands? Was it madness or prophecy? As whispers turned to warnings and danger closed in, one question haunted every corner of the frontier. Could the ugliest girl in town become the heart of a legacy that outlives them all? When a mountain man speaks prophecy and the world laughs, only time will tell who the fool truly was, what gave him the right to choose her, and what hidden strength made her worthy. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories bind us across wide plains, distant states, and kindred hearts. If you still believe in dignity, redemption, and standing up for the forgotten, then you belong here. Drop a comment with the state you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that speak to something deeper. The wind had a way of cutting through bone in the high plains of Wyoming territory, especially in March, when the snow turned wet and bitter. That morning, the town of Ash Hollow barely noticed the girl on the porch. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, a tattered shawl pulled tight over shoulders too wide for her age. Her boots were gone sold, she'd later realize, by her uncle not 3 days after Aunt Miriam was lowered into the earth. She had no hat, no gloves, just a satchel with a fading leather strap, and inside it, her mother's sketchbook, charcoal-stained pages of birds, prairie flowers, and a little girl with round cheeks and dreaming eyes. The door behind her slammed shut, the bolt thrown loud and final. Inside, she heard her uncle's voice, slurred from drink and sour from grief. "Ain't no room here for a mouth that don't earn." That was all he said before the lantern light blinked out through the window. She waited, hoping it was a cruel joke, that he'd crack the door open and say her name. But nothing came, not even footsteps. Her name was Clara-May. She had just turned 15. She was slow to speak, soft in her ways, and rounder than the other girls in town, round in the face, in the hips, in the belly, though she never had enough to eat. Her quietness made people uneasy. She didn't laugh on command or flatter out of fear, and when folks called her simple or strange, she simply blinked and stared like they were the ones not making sense. Now she stepped down from the porch, barefoot, the wood frozen and cracking beneath her heels. She didn't cry, not at first. Not until she passed the churchyard, where Aunt Miriam's grave still bore flowers picked by Clara's own hand. That's when the first tear rolled down her cheek, freezing before it reached her chin. The road turned to dirt, then to hard, uneven ground as she passed the last fence posts of town. Nobody stopped her. A few curtains moved, but no one opened their door. She was the girl nobody wanted. Not the schoolteacher who pitied her silence. Not the preacher's wife who once muttered she'd be unfit for marriage. Not even old Mabel Atwood, who watched from her window above the general store, fingers twitching near the curtain, but never pulling it aside. The sky darkened like bruised fruit. The wind howled low across the fields. Clara-May stepped into it with only the shawl, the satchel, and a pain in her chest so thick it made her breath short. Somewhere behind her, a rooster crowed, confused by the light, maybe, or warning of something unseen. She walked faster. The first flakes of snow came gentle, then cruel. By the time she reached the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of known land, the snow was falling sideways. Her toes were purple, her fingers numb. Still, she pressed on, drawn by instinct, or maybe a voice no one else could hear. She didn't know where she was going, only that she could not go back. They said he lived where no man should, high past the Devil's Hollow, where the trees grew gnarled and the wind screamed like a widow at dusk. Ezekiel Crow, his name alone, quieted card games and stiffened gossiping tongues. Some claimed he had a noose hung above his hearth, just in case the past ever caught up to him. Others whispered he slept with his boots on, rifle in hand, waiting for vengeance that hadn't yet come. But all agreed on one thing. He'd killed a man with his bare hands, crushed his windpipe like snapping a brittle branch, and not in war, neither, but over something personal, though no one dared guess what. The The stories traveled quick in Ash Hollow, carried by pipe smoke and rocking chairs, embroidered into quilting circles, and passed down like truth. The children played dare games, racing to the edge of the pine line and shouting his name into the dark. But not a soul crossed into his territory with serious intention, not if they valued their lives. Mabel Atwood stood at her window, hands trembling as she laced the final edge of her wool shawl. She was a midwife. But more than that, she was the town's quiet conscience, the one who remembered your mother's labor pains and who sat with your grandfather as he passed. She had delivered Clara-May herself, back when the girl's mother still had strength in her bones and color in her cheeks. Mabel watched now, eyes stinging, as Clara disappeared past the feed mill and into the pale horizon beyond. Her fingers grazed the curtain but didn't part it. It was not her time to act, not yet. "I should have gone sooner," she murmured to no one. Then, quieter, "Forgive me, child." Out where the fences gave way to brush and then to raw wilderness, Clara-May moved like a spirit unsure of her own body. Her feet bled now, the snow caking in cuts she couldn't feel. Her fingers were stiff around the leather satchel, its strap digging into her shoulder. The forest ahead loomed, black against a bruised sky, each tree like a sentinel daring her forward. She was too cold to think, too numb to fear, but the forest had rules, and she did not know them. The hush grew deep. The air was still. Then, a low growl, a ripple across the silence. Her breath hitched. Wolves. Not a single cry, but several. Distant but closing. She turned her head sharply, trying to see beyond the snow. Shadows moved between trunks, shapes with legs too long and eyes too near the ground. She stumbled faster, panic breaking through the numb. Her feet caught root, and she fell hard, palms scraping ice and rock. But she did not cry out. She pulled herself up, dizzy, the satchel bouncing against her side. Behind her, the howls came again closer. She pushed forward into the trees, deeper into the dark. And somewhere beyond sight, above the ridgeline where smoke rose thin and straight from a hidden chimney, a man paused in chopping wood. His eyes narrowed toward the sound no one else would have noticed, the irregular shuffle of footsteps in a place where none should be. He laid down his axe, slow and deliberate. Ezekiel Crow listened. Then he moved. The sky had turned a deep, sullen gray, the kind that didn't promise more snow so much as silence, thick, endless silence. Clara-May's breaths came in short bursts, her chest tight from the cold and panic, the air cutting like glass down her throat. Her vision blurred at the edges, the trees swaying as if in slow motion. Every step was a gamble, her legs stiff and slow, her bare feet blackened with ice and dirt. She didn't know how long she'd been walking, minutes, hours, the whole day. The trail was no longer a trail, just a tangle of branches and snow-covered ground. Then came the slope. Her foot slipped, and she tumbled, graceless and hard, landing on her side against a rock hidden beneath the snowpack. The pain didn't register. Nothing did anymore. She tried to rise but collapsed again, this time onto her hands, which gave out from under her. Her fingers were blue now. She saw them, strange and stiff like they belonged to someone else. Her satchel slipped from her shoulder and landed beside her, the edge of the sketchbook peeking out as if in quiet witness. The wind picked up, pushing snow in swirls over her body, like the earth was already preparing her grave. Clara's lips moved, but no sound came. She wasn't praying. She wasn't begging. She just wanted to stay warm, and the snow seemed kinder than the world she'd left behind. Her eyes fluttered, then closed. Up the ridge, nestled behind pine and stone, Ezekiel Crow's cabin sat like a secret. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He had returned early from the trapline, unsettled by something he couldn't name, a pressure behind his eyes, a stillness that didn't match the season. Now he moved along the bluff, rifle slung over his shoulder, stepped soundless through the drifts. His gaze caught something below, a shape too still, too soft against the chaos of snow and rock. He narrowed his eyes. She looked like a pile of fabric at first, until he saw the hand, curled and limp, half buried beneath the snow. His body reacted before his mind did. He descended the trail, boots careful but quick. When he reached her, he dropped to one knee and hesitated, not at the cold, nor the risk, but at the shape of her hand. It was small, round-fingered, the skin bruised with frost. Just like Lila's, the memory hit him without mercy, his daughter's hand, reaching through smoke, her cries muffled by the roaring fire. His arms too slow, too weak, he clenched his jaw, squeezing his eyes shut, forcing the image away. That was 10 years ago. This was now. He reached out and touched the girl's cheek, cold as stone, but not yet gone. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A beat, faint but steady, alive. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Then louder, to the forest, or God, or both. "Damn it all." Without another word, he swept her into his arms. She was heavier than she looked, but he bore it without struggle, as if weight meant nothing when it came with purpose. The satchel dangled from her shoulder. He didn't notice it. He didn't care. He turned back up the slope, each step sure, fast, cutting through the wild as if guided by something ancient. The snow closed in behind them, erasing the trail, hiding what had happened. And the trees, those towering sentinels, watched in silence as the mountain swallowed them whole. The first thing she felt was warmth, not gentle warmth, but thick and heavy, like the heat from a stove left burning too long. It pressed into her skin, seeped into her bones. Then came the crackling, not from frost or branches, but from firewood, slow, steady, alive. She stirred beneath layers she didn't recognize, thick quilts that smelled of pine and smoke, rough-spun wool resting against her cheek, a weight across her legs that suggested safety instead of threat. Her eyes opened slowly, lashes stiff with dried frost, vision blurred by the sudden contrast between dark and firelight. The room was dim but alive. Logs chinked with clay formed the walls, and the window panes were fogged with breath and weather. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the hearth at the far end of the room. A stew pot hung over the flames, steam rising in soft spirals. She lay on a low bed in the corner, wrapped in more blankets than she'd ever known in her life. And across the room, silent as a ghost, sat the man. He was not reading, not eating, just sitting, hands clasped, elbows on his knees, head bowed slightly, as if listening for something the rest of the world had forgotten. His beard was gray through the dark, thick and wild, and his coat hung beside him on a nail, still damp at the edges from melted snow. He did not look up when her eyes opened, but he knew. "You'll live," he said simply. His voice was low, sandpaper over stone, not unkind, but without softness, as if kindness was something earned, not given. Clara swallowed. Her throat ached. She tried to sit up, but her body was too heavy, her limbs slow to obey. "Best not move much. You were near froze." Fever took hold for a while. He stood then, tall and broad, his frame casting a long shadow that reached to the foot of her bed. He moved toward the stove and ladled something from the pot into a tin cup. When he approached again, he knelt not to eye level, but close enough for her to see the flecks of snow still caught in his boots. "Drink, careful now." He handed her the cup. She took it with trembling hands. The broth was thin but hot, the taste of meat and root warming her mouth, sliding down her throat like melted courage. She hadn't realized she was starving until that moment. Her stomach gurgled in protest, but she sipped slowly. He watched, then nodded once and turned away. "Name's Ezekiel Crow," he said over his shoulder as he returned to his chair. "Don't ask me why I brought you here. Ain't rightly sure myself." She opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what she'd even say. "Thank you? I'm sorry? Please don't send me back?" Instead, she looked around. There was no mirror, but she saw herself in the soot-darkened window, a pale, rounded face, hair matted, lips cracked. A stranger. Yet something in this place, in this man who refused to meet her gaze, settled her pulse. He wasn't warm, he wasn't gentle, but there was no cruelty in him. That alone made this the safest place she'd ever been. The fire popped, the wind howled once outside, but it did not enter, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Clara-May let her eyes drift closed, not from exhaustion, but from trust. The days slipped by like snow melting from the eaves, slow, unnoticed, until suddenly the ground began to show beneath. Clara-May woke each morning to the smell of ash and pine, the thump of wood being split, the groan of floorboards as heavy boots moved across the cabin. Ezekiel never announced himself. He came and went like a weather pattern predictable only in his silence. He left food near the hearth before disappearing outside, sometimes for hours, sometimes longer. When he returned, he brought pelts, caught hares, fresh-cut firewood, and once a jar of honey so old the wax seal had crumbled. Clara did not speak much either. Her voice was still hoarse, her throat healing from cold and fever. But more than that, she sensed that words were unnecessary here. They might even break something delicate. Instead, she listened. To the way Ezekiel cleared his throat when entering the room. To the way he muttered to the fire when it burned too fast. To the way the trees creaked like old bones just beyond the cabin walls. It was a symphony of solitude, and somehow she found herself in tune with it. On the third day, she opened her satchel. The sketchbook was still there, the pages slightly warped from the cold, the charcoal smudged from moisture. Her hands hovered over it for a long time before she finally opened it to a blank sheet and touched the tip of a broken pencil to the page. Her fingers ached, her wrists trembled, but the lines came anyway, tentative, looping, fragile as spider thread. A squirrel on the windowsill, its fur bristled with snow. The kettle on the stove, steam curling like smoke from a chimney. The shape of a hand she could not forget. She drew when Ezekiel wasn't looking. Or so she thought. He always seemed to be just out of view, sharpening his axe on the porch, tending the trap line, carving something in the barn. But once, as she shaded the haunches of a fox she'd seen near the edge of the woods, she felt his gaze on her. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The air changed when he was near, not heavier, but more still, like a held breath. He lingered, then moved on. That night, he spoke without prompting. "You draw real fine." She blinked, surprised. She looked over. He was stirring the stew with a carved spoon, his back to her. Noticed that sketch of the pine marten. Caught one last winter. Mean little thing. He paused. But smart. She nodded, unsure if he wanted more. He didn't. In the evenings, he let her sit near the fire while he read from a tattered Bible with missing pages. She never asked if he believed what was in it. He never asked what she believed. It didn't matter. The quiet between them grew easier, like well-worn boots breaking in. She began humming sometimes, not songs with words, just sounds that rose and fell like the wind through the trees. One morning, he left a fresh pencil on top of her sketchbook. Said nothing, just nodded once before heading out to chop wood. She held it like a gift. Out in the forest, where wolves once howled and shadows chased her, there now stood a place of warmth, and in it, a girl the world had cast aside began to draw herself back into being. The fox kit came with the morning frost, whimpering near the woodshed, a scrap of red fur and raw bone barely breathing beneath a tangle of branches. Clara spotted it first as she stepped outside to shake out the blankets, her breath clouding in the crisp air. She knelt without hesitation, fingers gentle despite the cold. The creature's leg was twisted unnaturally, caught in the last snare Ezekiel had meant to dismantle but hadn't yet reached. It trembled as she scooped it up, its ribs sharp against her palms, its eyes clouded with pain but not fear. Ezekiel saw her return with it and said nothing at first. He watched from the chopping block, hands wrapped around the axe handle, the rhythm of his work slowing but never stopping. She passed him with a nod. The fox held close to her chest. His jaw tightened, but he didn't forbid her. Inside the cabin, she made a nest from rags and pine shavings near the fire. She boiled water, tore strips from one of her underdresses, and cleaned the wound as best she could. The kit whimpered once, then settled. She fed it bits of cooked rabbit and crumbled cornbread, coaxing it with patience that few people had ever shown her. Ezekiel returned to the cabin an hour later, his boots heavy with snow. He paused at the doorway, his gaze falling on the fox, then on Clara, who was humming low as she dabbed the creature's brow with a wet cloth. He said nothing, just walked past them and set the axe down by the wall. That evening, over stew and silence, he spoke. Most folk would have put it down. Clara glanced at him, unsure if it was a warning. "She didn't ask to be hurt," Clara said softly. "And she's still breathing." He grunted, neither agreement nor challenge, then returned to his bowl. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the chopping of wood outside and the flicker of the fire within. Clara changed the fox's bandages daily, coaxed it to eat, whispered to it when the pain returned. Ezekiel watched from a distance, always working, always silent, but his eyes lingered longer each time. He saw how her hands, once red and cracked, now moved with quiet purpose. He saw how the kit began to lift its head when Clara approached, how it wagged its tail weakly when she sang. He never praised her, but he brought extra rags without being asked, left bones from his own plate, and once she caught him kneeling beside the kit while he thought she was outside, just watching it breathe. But there were lines between them still, invisible but deep. And one night Clara crossed one. The fire was low, the fox curled in its nest, sleeping. Ezekiel sat in his usual chair, whittling a piece of cedar into something shapeless. Clara turned her gaze to the wall, where a single drawing was pinned with a rusted nail, a child's sketch, faded and smudged with age. It showed a stick-figure girl holding a flower beside a cabin much like this one. The handwriting at the bottom was wobbly but legible. For Pa. Love, Lila. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Was she yours? The sound of the blade against wood stopped. The silence stretched long enough for the fire to crackle 3 times. Then he stood. Abruptly, the cedar dropped to the floor. Without a word, Ezekiel yanked open the cabin door. Cold wind rushed in, scattering embers. He stepped out into the night and slammed the door behind him. The fox lifted its head. Clara flinched, her chest tight, breath caught like a bird in a snare. She did not chase him. She sat quietly, staring at the child's drawing, hand resting gently on the fox's side. The wind outside wailed, but inside she stayed still, her heart aching for a wound she now knew was not hers alone. The air in Ash Hollow had turned thin and sharp, as it always did near the end of winter. Snow lingered in the shady corners of the town, but the main road had gone to mud, streaked with wagon tracks and boot prints from the early risers. In the general store, the gossip started with a dropped tin of beans and a sideways glance. By the time the preacher's wife came in for sugar, the whispers had thickened into suspicion. "Girl's been gone over 2 weeks now," muttered old Denny Briggs, hunched behind the wood stove, his pipe long since gone cold. "Ain't right, a girl that age vanishin'. No kin left to speak for her. She weren't all there, that one," said Mrs. Prindle from behind a tower of canned peaches, thick in the middle and thick in the head. "Walking out into the woods like that. Might have done herself in. Or maybe," added someone else, low and sharp, "maybe she ran to him." Silence fell like dust. All heads turned toward the window, where the mountains rose in jagged defiance of the town's reach. Everyone knew who him was. Ezekiel Crow. The stories had always been there, coiled and waiting like rattlers under floorboards, that he once worked with his hands in the mines, that he snapped a man's neck in the street over a poker game, that he hadn't set foot in town in a decade, and didn't need to, because the hills fed him and the forest kept his secrets. But it wasn't until Mabel Atwood walked through the door, apron still dusted with flour, eyes clear and unsentimental, that the story changed shape. "I know what you're saying," she said plainly, setting down her basket of dried herbs on the counter, "and I'll not let it rot the truth." Denny huffed. "You got something better, Mabel?" She straightened her back, lifting her chin like she did when delivering a child under candlelight. Ezekiel Crow had a wife, Ruthie, sweet girl with a voice like bird song and hands that stitched quilts so fine they ended up in the county fair 3 years running. They had a daughter, Lila, bright, curious little thing who used to sit at my feet while I mixed poultices and ask what every herb did. She was 6. The store was silent but for the clink of metal against glass as someone set a jar down too hard. They lived quiet up there, kept to themselves, didn't bother nobody. Then the railroad men came. Wanted the ridge Ezekiel built his cabin on. Said it was the straightest line through the pass. Ezekiel said no. They didn't like no. Mabel's voice faltered, just once. Then it returned, iron-laced. One night, the cabin burned. Fire leapt so high, it lit the clouds. By the time Ezekiel got Ruthie out, Lila was already gone. The men never got their right of way, but they got their vengeance. Town never proved nothing, but we all knew. A woman near the door crossed herself. "He never remarried? Never set foot in town again," Mabel answered. And now that girl Clara is up there with him, and I reckon some of you are wondering if she's next." The room held its breath. "She ain't," Mabel said firmly. "That man's done with hurtin', whether you believe it or not. That child might be the first thing to bring warmth back to that mountain in a long, long while." But as she turned to leave, the murmurs started again, softer, like wind slipping under a door. "He's still a killer," someone whispered. "Maybe grief made him dangerous. Or maybe," said a voice Mabel didn't recognize, "he never stopped being dangerous." Outside, the clouds moved low and fast, skimming the tops of the pines. The town of Ash Hollow settled into its old rhythm, but something had shifted, something brittle and restless in the hearts of those who feared what they could not see. And up in the hills, where snow still clung to the ridgelines, the ghost of Lila Crow stirred in memory and rumor, refusing to be forgotten. The fire burned low in the hearth, its glow flickering weakly against the log walls, as if unsure whether to stay or fade. Outside, the wind had died down, and the snow hung heavy on the branches like breath held too long. Inside the cabin, silence had settled, not the peaceful kind they were used to, but one that throbbed, thick with things unsaid. Clara sat by the window, her sketchbook unopened on her lap. The fox kit slept nearby, curled into the warmth of its makeshift nest, its injured leg mending more each day. But tonight, even the little creature seemed restless, twitching in its sleep as if sensing the unease in the room. Ezekiel sat across from her, sharpening his knife by lantern light, the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone, the only sound for the past half hour. He hadn't looked at her, not really, not since the night she asked about the child's drawing, the night he'd left without a word and returned long after midnight, face pale and clothes wet from snow. Since then, they'd spoken only in necessity: wood, food, weather. Everything else stayed locked behind walls, thicker than these logs. But Clara could feel it pressing down on them both, the weight of the thing unspoken, and she couldn't bear it any longer. She stood, voice trembling but sure. Who was Lila? The scraping stopped. His hand froze mid-motion. The knife hung in the air, suspended like a question he'd never wanted to hear again. "I need to know," she said, stepping closer. "Not because I'm curious, because I'm here, and I'm not afraid of ghosts." He set the knife down with care. His hands trembled once, just briefly, before he clasped them together and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. For a long moment, he stared into the fire. Then he spoke. She was 6, bright as spring water, fast as a jackrabbit, mouth always running. Her Ma Ruthie called her little lantern, 'cause she lit up every corner she walked into. We built this cabin when Ruthie was carrying her. Every board, every nail, I set with my own hands. Thought I'd made him a place safe from the world. He paused, jaw clenched. His eyes didn't rise from the flames. Then the railroad came. Men with papers and maps and gold teeth said the ridge belonged to the company now. I told him to get off my land, told him I'd die before I signed it over. His voice dropped, brittle and raw. They came back one night. I was out checking traps. Found the barn burning first. Ran to the house. Ruthie was already screaming. Got her out, barely. Tried to go back in for Lila, but the roof gave. Whole place come down like the Lord himself had turned on me. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent as snowfall. Found her drawing days later, tucked in my coat pocket. Meant to give it to me that night. Said she was sorry for knocking over the stew pot. His voice broke, and he shook his head like a man trying to banish a dream too cruel to survive. "I couldn't save her," he said, "and I ain't lived a day since that I don't wish it had been me instead." Clara stepped closer, her bare feet soundless on the floorboards. She reached out, unsure, but her hand found his calloused, weathered, and trembling with something older than grief. "You saved me," she whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked. And for the first time in years, Ezekiel Crow saw something in another's eyes that wasn't pity or fear. He saw forgiveness. And it undid him. The morning came soft and gray, the kind of day where the world feels hushed, as though holding its breath. A light snow drifted down, quiet as ash, settling on the roof of the cabin, on the broken fence post, on the tracks left by a fox healed and free. Inside, the fire still smoldered in the hearth, its warmth lingering even as the flames had settled into glowing coals. Clara sat at the table with a small stack of papers in front of her hands folded neatly, trembling slightly. Her eyes kept drifting to the corner shelf above Ezekiel's bed, the place where the old tin frame Saturday. She'd found it 2 days ago while sweeping the dust from beneath the cot. The photograph had slipped from between a pair of folded shirts wrapped in oilcloth. It was faded, edges curled and torn, but the image was still there. Ruthie with her long dark hair pinned up and smiling softly, and Lila in her arms, face bright and round, little fingers clutching a rag doll. Clara hadn't asked to keep it. She'd simply looked at it long enough to remember every line of Lila's face, then returned it to its hiding place. But the image hadn't left her mind. It had moved into her, lived in her hands, and last night, as the wind moaned outside and Ezekiel sat silent beside the fire, she had begun to draw. Now, she waited. Ezekiel stepped in from outside, shoulders dusted in snow, carrying a bundle of chopped kindling. He set it by the hearth, brushed his hands off, and looked toward her, a grunt of greeting on his lips. But he stopped when he saw her expression solemn, eyes lowered, something fragile resting in her hands. She stood and walked toward him, holding out the drawing like an offering. "I hope it's all right," she said softly. I found the photograph. I just wanted to give her back to you, if only for a little while." He took the page with a careful hand, his fingers brushing hers, then settling around the edges of the paper, like it might crumble if held too tight. He looked down. It was Lila clearer than the old photograph could ever show. Clara had drawn her seated in a field of wildflowers, light on her cheeks, eyes wide with mischief, hair caught in a breeze that danced across the page. She held the same rag doll, but this time it smiled with her. The scene wasn't exact, it wasn't copied. It was reimagined, brought to life with strokes of charcoal and care, shaped by the hands of a girl who understood what it meant to lose and still love. Ezekiel didn't speak. His jaw tightened, and he blinked hard, as if fighting something deep within. He sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the paper still in his hands, elbows resting on his knees. And then it came. First a single breath, then a shudder. His shoulders began to shake. No sound escaped him, but the tears fell fast, heavier than snow, heavier than memory. He bowed his head over the drawing, the ache of 10 winters finally breaking free, and wept for the little girl he couldn't save, for the wife he buried, for the fire he never escaped. Clara stood still, tears slipping down her own cheeks, not from guilt or fear, but from the rawness of seeing another soul laid bare. She stepped forward and knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. He didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the crackle of coals and the hush of snow on the roof. No words passed between them, none were needed. In the quiet, in the shared grief and the drawing between them, something was born, a silent bond not of blood, but of choice. Ezekiel folded the drawing carefully and set it on the mantel, beside the old photograph. Then he looked at Clara not as a burden or a reminder, but as something steady and living. "You've got her heart," he said at last. "Maybe stronger." She didn't answer, only held his gaze. And in that moment, they were no longer two broken things merely surviving. They were a family, small and wounded, but beginning. The thaw came slow that year, as though winter was reluctant to loosen its grip. Streams began to trickle through the ice, and the snow turned to slush beneath boot and hoof. In Ash Hollow, the streets grew noisy again, with wagons creaking and hammers clanging, the rhythm of trade returning like breath to a long sleeping chest. But with the warmth came something colder still. Silas Creed rode in on a black stallion, his long coat dusted with ash-gray trail dirt, his boots polished clean enough to reflect firelight. He wore a bowler hat tipped just enough to shadow his eyes, and the townspeople felt that shadow long before they saw him. He hadn't been seen in Ash Hollow for nearly a decade, not since the night the cabin on the ridge burned. Folks figured him gone for good, moved east with the rails or west with the gold. But here he was thinner, meaner, and flanked by 3 hired men with rifles, strapped to their backs and eyes that looked dead of conscience. He dismounted in front of the town hall, handed his reins to a boy who didn't dare ask for a tip, and stepped through the doors like a man who still believed the world owed him something. By dusk, The talk had reached Mabel Atwood's ears. "Creed's back," she said, pushing through the church's rear door where Reverend Gaines was lighting the candles for evening prayer. "And he's got papers in hand, claims to own the ridge outright. Ezekiel still lives there," the Reverend said, voice low, uncertain. Mabel nodded grimly. "Which is likely the point." But the worst of it came 2 days later, when the postwriter brought up a letter from Cheyenne, an official-looking document with a red seal and ink so fresh it still smelled of law. Clara-May's name was on it, not scribbled or scrawled, but typed with precision. Indenture contract. According to the paper, she belonged to Silas Creed, now signed over by her uncle in exchange for a liquor debt and the promise of steady rail work. The terms were as cruel as they were clear. She was property, in all but name, bound to serve Creed's interests until the age of 21. No wages, no say. Ezekiel stared at the document long after Mabel had read it aloud. Clara stood by the fire, lips pressed tight, arms wrapped around herself as though to keep her name from being peeled off her bones. The fox kit, now half-grown, sensed the tension and slinked beneath the bed. Ezekiel's jaw worked slowly, a storm gathering behind his eyes. "This paper don't mean a thing," he said, voice like gravel dragged through iron. "No man owns her." "They'll come with guns," Mabel said quietly. "Silas doesn't bring ink without iron." Ezekiel looked to Clara then. She had not wept, she had not spoken, but the firelight lit her face in such a way that Mabel would later swear she saw steel in the girl's gaze. "If he comes for me," Clara said, "he'll have to come through you." Ezekiel nodded once, a solemn promise carved in silence. Outside, the mountain winds shifted, and the last of the snow slid from the ridge, bearing the soil beneath. Creed had come for land. Now he wanted something more, and neither Ezekiel nor Clara would give it easy. The morning after the papers came, the sky broke open with a restless wind, as if the mountain itself had been stirred from slumber. The trees groaned under the shifting pressure, and the clouds skated low over the ridge, bruised and thick. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel paced with slow, heavy steps, his brow furrowed beneath the weight of something he hadn't carried in years, a choice that didn't just belong to him. Clara sat at the table, her fingers brushing the rim of a tin mug, long gone cold. Her eyes followed him, not out of fear, but with a calm clarity, as though she'd already made peace with something he had not. "You don't have to stay," Ezekiel said finally, voice gruff, barely above a whisper. "A man like Silas, he don't take kindly to being challenged. I could pack you a mule, set you south toward Canyon Ridge. Mabel's got kin down that way. Good folk. You'd be safe." Clara didn't look away. She let the words settle like dust between them, then brushed them aside with the quietest defiance. "I'm not leaving." Ezekiel's hand stilled. She stood, her voice soft but steady. "All my life I've been trying to disappear, to be small enough, quiet enough, forgettable enough, so no one would think me worth hurting. But it didn't stop the hurt. Not then, not now. And I'm done running." She took a breath, her eyes locked on his. "I'd rather stand and be seen than run and disappear." He studied her for a long moment, eyes narrowing not in doubt but in awe. Then he nodded one sharp, final motion and reached for the latch on the cellar door. By nightfall, the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stronghold. Ezekiel cleared out the root cellar and lined it with fresh kindling and food stores in case they were forced to retreat. He reinforced the windows with timber, nailed crossbars across the shutters, and set iron spikes outside the narrow path leading up to the ridge. The cabin, once shaped by grief, now braced for siege. Clara worked alongside him. She hauled wood, drove nails, sharpened knives. The fox kit trailed behind her like a loyal shadow, ever watchful, ever wary. She didn't ask for rest, nor did she flinch when Ezekiel returned, with a wrapped bundle slung over his shoulder, a rifle long and worn, with a scar down the stock and history in every groove. He placed it on the table and opened the cloth. "It was Ruthie's," he said quietly. "She kept it oiled and clean, even when she was 8 months along with Lila. Said a woman ought to know how to hold her own." Clara ran her fingers along the barrel, reverent. Ezekiel taught her to load it with patient hands. He showed her the rhythm of breath, the squeeze of the trigger, the way not to blink when the world cracked open in your grip. Her aim was clumsy at first, but steady. By the third afternoon, she struck the tin can from 20 paces and didn't smile. She didn't need to. As the wind picked up and clouds circled like vultures above, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin with the rifle resting against her shoulder. No longer a ghost of a girl, no longer waiting to be claimed. She had chosen her place. And Ezekiel Crow, who once buried his heart beneath ash and stone, stood beside her not as a guardian, but as something closer, something harder, one family. Forged not by blood, but by the will to fight for what the world tried to discard. The storm rolled in heavy and sudden, not from the east like most, but from the north, tumbling over the ridge like a tide of white wrath. Snow piled thick and fast, erasing the trail to the valley in hours, coating the trees in silence, and suffocating the world in cold. By dusk, it was clear. No one would come up, and no one would go down, not for days. Inside the cabin, the fire roared high. Ezekiel stacked wood by the hearth in tall, neat piles, his shoulders dusted in snow. Clara moved through the cramped space with quiet ease, ladling stew into bowls, laying wool blankets across the bed, brushing stray ash from the table. The fox kit, nearly grown now, strong and limping only slightly curled near the door, eyes half-lidded but watchful. By the second night, they spoke more than usual, the stillness outside pushing them inward. Ezekiel told her about the strange sound elk make in mating season, a sharp bugle that echoed like sorrow through the pines. Clara listened, eyes wide, then shared how her mother used to hum to the bread dough while it rose, believing it made it lighter. These were not confessions, not exactly just the kind of stories people tell when there's nowhere else to go and nothing left to hide behind. On the third evening, the wind let up just enough to hear the snow sliding from the roof in soft thumps. Clara sat cross-legged near the fire, sketchbook in hand, drawing the profile of the fox by firelight. Ezekiel sat nearby, sharpening a blade out of habit more than need, though his eyes often drifted to her with a look that held something unspoken. "I used to think," Clara said, her voice barely louder than the crackling wood, "that if I could just be quieter or smaller or less," she paused, "then maybe someone might keep me." Ezekiel looked up. "My uncle used to say I was too much," she went on, not looking at him. "Too much work, too much mouth, too much weight, but not enough to matter." He didn't answer at first, just watched her as the firelight caught the curve of her cheek and the steady movement of her pencil. Finally, he set the blade down. "You ever see a tree grow crooked?" he asked. She nodded. "They grow that way 'cause they had to. Wind, rock, bad soil. Still stand, don't they?" She met his eyes. He held her gaze a long moment, then nodded once, slowly, with something deep and rooted behind it. "You got more grit than most men I've buried, and more soul than this valley deserves." He shifted in his chair, jaw working. Then he said it not like a man laying claim, but like one speaking truth into a world that had forgotten how to name value. "She'll birth me a dynasty." Clara's breath caught. The words settled over her like snowfall, not heavy, but whole. Her eyes widened, not in fear or shame, but in wonder, because for the first time in her life, someone wasn't trying to use her, fix her, or hide her. He saw her, not as a burden, not as a stray, but as the beginning of something that might last beyond them both. And in the hush that followed, while the storm howled faintly through the trees and the fire cast shadows that danced on the walls, Clara closed her sketchbook and smiled, not because she was wanted, but because she was finally known. The thaw had begun, but the path down the mountain was still treacherous mud, thick as molasses and ridges cut deep by meltwater. Mabel Atwood rode anyway. Her old mare, Bonnie, picked her way through the ruts with careful steps, each hoofall splashing grit and ice. Mabel's cloak whipped behind her in the wind, and her hands were red and raw from gripping the reins, but she didn't slow. Not for the cold, not for the ache in her joints, and certainly not for fear. She had seen too many births and too many burials to be turned aside by either pain or pride. Ash Hollow had grown noisier in the weeks since Silas Creed's return. Folks bustled more in the street now, but with their heads lower, eyes narrowed in suspicion and half-swallowed worry. Mabel rode through them without a nod or a word, her jaw set. She tethered Bonnie in front of the town hall and climbed the steps with the authority of a woman who had delivered half the children in town and laid out more than a few of its dead. The mayor was inside Porter Gilroy, a man better suited to selling feed than leading people. He sat behind his desk fiddling with a quill, sweat on his brow despite the cold. Beside him stood Preacher Weller, stiff-backed, thumbs hooked into his vest, looking down at Mabel like she was a wayward sheep who'd wandered too far into judgment. Mabel didn't wait to be asked. "Silas Creed is a liar and a thief," she said plainly, "and if you let him use this town to hunt down a girl like Clara-May, then you'll be judged by more than men." Preacher Weller gave a quiet scoff. "The document bears a seal." "I don't give a fig for his seal," Mabel snapped. "I've seen better men forge worse. That girl was thrown out like trash by her own blood, and the first soul who treated her with dignity was the very man y'all fear in whispers." Mayor Gilroy shifted uncomfortably. "We can't take sides, Mabel. There's law." "Law?" Her voice rose, not with rage, but with the kind of righteous fury that came from years of holding hands through death and birth. "The law didn't speak when Lila Crow burned. The law turned its back when Ruthie's body was buried beneath ice. You let Silas walk free then, and you'll do it again now if you don't grow a spine." The room fell into silence. Mabel leaned forward, her voice low now, sharp as a needle. "Ezekiel Crow may be rough, but he's more decent than half this town. And Clara-May, she's got more grace in her quiet stare than Silas Creed has in his whole silver-plated soul." Later that afternoon, the murmurs began again, but this time they were different. Clara's name was not spoken with pity, but with curiosity. Ezekiel's past was weighed not just by fire and fear, but by what Mabel had said, by the weight of grief, and what a man becomes when the world steals everything but his honor. The blacksmith's wife mentioned how Clara had once carried groceries for her when no one else would help. The schoolteacher recalled a picture Clara had drawn of the church bell, so detailed it had made him weep. Even old Mrs. Prindle, sharp-tongued and sour-eyed, muttered that maybe things weren't so simple after all. The town was still afraid, but now they were also unsure, and in the heart of that uncertainty, a single truth had begun to take root, spoken by a woman who had seen too much to believe in fear over fairness. Sometimes the monsters weren't the ones who lived in the mountains. Sometimes they wore polished boots and brought papers sealed in blood. Rain followed the thaw, softening the hard-packed roads and turning the edges of town to dark, sticky clay. It smeared footprints, blurred tracks, and forced people to walk slower, to look around instead of rushing past, and in that quieted pace, Ash Hollow began to listen. The blacksmith, Tobias Crane, was the first to speak in public. He stood tall in front of his forge, the fire behind him throwing gold across his soot-darkened face. His voice was rough from years of shaping iron, but it carried. "I ain't never spoke well of Ezekiel Crow," he said to a gathering of men huddled under the eaves of the saloon. "But I'll say this, when my boy got caught in the creek last spring, it was Ezekiel who pulled him out. Didn't wait for thanks, just left the boy on my porch and vanished. If that's the kind of monster Creed says he is, then maybe monsters are better than men." Word of that testimony spread faster than kindling in a dry wind. The schoolteacher followed, a thin man with spectacles and a stammer, known more for grading spelling tests than speaking his mind. But one morning, he stood outside the church and held up a small piece of paper, a drawing, curled at the corners, smudged with time. A bell tower, intricately shaded in charcoal, the name Clara-May, signed at the bottom in small, shy letters. "She gave this to me last fall," he said. Said it was how she remembered the sound of hope. Said it reminded her of her mother. He swallowed hard. That girl isn't just some vagrant hiding in the hills. She sees the good in things most of us have forgotten. Later that day, during a baking contest of all things, the young preacher's wife, Abigail Weller, took her turn. Her voice was not loud, but it was kind. And sometimes kindness can be sharper than any shout. "I visited that girl once when her aunt was still alive," she said gently, pouring tea for a half-dozen women in the parlor. "She offered me the only piece of sweetbread she had, then apologized for not having two. I've never forgotten that." From there, the talk grew legs. It moved through the general store, curled around the benches in front of the schoolhouse, crept into pews before sermons. It shook loose the silence that had lived in Ash Hollow for too long, and with it came the questions. If Ezekiel Crow had once saved a child, who were they to call him a threat? If Clara-May had once seen beauty in a bell tower, why call her simple? If Silas Creed owned the law, did that mean he owned their souls? The mayor, red-faced and sweating, called for a public meeting. The whole town was to gather in the chapel on Sunday. Creed had offered to bring his paperwork, and the townsfolk would hear both sides. In fairness, he said, though his eyes flicked nervously to Mabel in the crowd. The bell rang out that evening, just once, long and slow. Not a call to worship, but a call to reckon. Inside homes with candlelit windows, people sat around tables and said names they hadn't dared say aloud in years. Ruthie, Lila, Ezekiel, Clara. They said them not with scorn, but with care, as if speaking them might stitch something back together. And somewhere beyond town, up on the ridge, a girl held a rifle and a man sharpened an old blade, both unaware that the hearts of strangers were beginning, at long last, to turn. The chapel bells rang 3 times that morning, long, solemn peals that echoed through Ash Hollow like the voice of a judge clearing his throat. The townsfolk came in boots, still caked with thaw mud, shawls pulled tight, whispers low. They filled the pews and the back aisles, even the window sills, where boys leaned in to listen with wide eyes. No hymns were sung, no scripture read. The air was too heavy for that. The room buzzed with the kind of tension usually reserved for gallows or weddings, when everyone knew something was about to change. At the front of the chapel stood Silas Creed, sharp as ever in his dark coat and polished boots, his gold watch chain glinting in the morning light. On either side of him stood hired guns, grim men with cold eyes and calloused knuckles, rifles slung and ready. He didn't sit, he didn't smile. He waited, a snake with a legal document instead of fangs. The crowd parted when Ezekiel and Clara arrived. He walked tall, not with swagger, but with purpose, every step steady and sure. Beside him, Clara wore her mother's Sunday dress, a simple blue calico with tiny white flowers and buttons that had been resewn by hand. It was too short in the sleeves and a touch too tight at the waist, but she wore it like armor. Her hair was pinned back, and her eyes held not fear but resolve, the kind of resolve born only from being cast aside and choosing to rise anyway. They reached the chapel doors and did not enter. They stood there in the morning light, facing the congregation inside. Ezekiel's hat was in his hand. Clara held nothing but her breath. Silas turned, lips curled just enough to mock. "Well," he drawled, "if it ain't the ghost and the girl." Ezekiel didn't reply. He didn't have to. The room was quiet now, all ears turned toward the altar, where Mayor Gilroy fumbled with the official-looking document Silas had thrust into his hands earlier. "This contract here," the mayor began, clearing his throat, "claims that Clara-May Barnes was indentured to Mr. Creed through a debt owed by her legal guardian." "He ain't my kin," Clara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room like a bell chime. "And he ain't got the right to sell what he never cared for." Silas's smirk didn't waver. "The law says otherwise, girl." And then Mabel stepped forward. She wore her best shawl and walked with a limp from the long ride 2 days prior, but her grip was firm on the folded letter she held aloft. "Not all the law," she said. "This letter was written by your brother, Amos Creed, signed, sealed, and witnessed, dated 2 years ago after Clara's mother died. It states he never intended to enforce the contract, nor accept Clara as payment for any debt." The room gasped. Even the preacher's wife clutched her husband's arm. Silas stepped forward, but the marshal, who had arrived silent and unnoticed at the back of the chapel, raised a hand. "That your brother's signature?" he asked, stepping into the aisle. Silas hesitated. "That's not what's on trial here," he muttered. The marshal's voice was flat. "It is now." Silas looked at the crowd, looked at the letter, then at Clara. His confidence cracked, just slightly, the shine of his coat no longer enough to blind them to what he truly was. Mabel handed the letter to the mayor. "Seems the dead speak clearer than the living." And in that moment, the room shifted. Ezekiel placed his hand gently on Clara's shoulder. She didn't flinch. Together, they stepped into the chapel. And the man who thought he could buy silence was met instead with a girl in a borrowed dress, a town that remembered its conscience, and a truth that could no longer be buried beneath paper or fear. The doors of the chapel had barely finished swinging shut behind Clara and Ezekiel when the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the muddy road, slow, steady, and deliberate. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the pews. A tall figure on horseback approached, his coat long and dusted with trail grit, his hat pulled low against the morning glare. Behind him rode a deputy, and behind them, silence, save for the creak of saddle leather and the whistle of a crow somewhere in the distance. Judge Alton Merriweather dismounted without ceremony. He was a man known more for his silence than his speeches, but his word held weight, and his name carried fear in the hearts of those who mistook land for power. He'd ridden the circuit for 20 years, from river towns to mountain posts, and it was said he could smell a crooked deal before the ink dried. He stepped into the chapel without invitation, the congregation parting like the Red Sea. He looked at no one, not at first, and then fixed his eyes on Silas Creed. "You've made a claim on a girl," he said, voice like gravel beneath boot heel, "and a claim on land, both under dispute. I'm here to sort that." Silas stiffened. "This is a town matter. I already filed the deed." "And I have the letter," Mabel interrupted, stepping forward with measured grace. "Signed by Amos Creed himself, revoking any right to Clara-May Barnes, and witnessed by 2 men still breathing." Judge Merriweather took the letter, scanned it with narrowed eyes, then looked to the mayor. "You've seen this?" Mayor Gilroy nodded sheepishly. "Just this morning." The judge turned next to Ezekiel. "And you, Crow, you claim guardianship of the girl?" Ezekiel met the man's gaze squarely. "No claim. She chose to stay. I chose to protect her." Clara, standing beside him, said nothing, but her chin was lifted, and her hands were steady. She didn't need to speak. She had already spoken with her courage. From the back, the blacksmith stood. "He's done right by her." Then the teacher. "She belongs with him more than she ever did with any of us." Even Preacher Weller's wife spoke up, hands folded tight over her chest. "She's not property. She's a child of God." Judge Merriweather listened without expression. Then he turned back to Silas. "You filed a false indenture. You attempted to leverage influence in a town that no longer fears you, and you invoked the law in bad faith." Silas stepped forward, desperation flaring. "That land's still mine. He never signed it over." "No," the judge said, folding the letter and placing it into his coat. "And neither did his daughter. Which means the original homestead claim holds." He gestured to his deputy. "You have an hour to leave this town, Creed. You and your men. You'll be escorted to the ridge, and from there you'll ride south and not return. If you do, I'll see you tried for fraud, coercion, and attempted unlawful possession of a minor. That clear?" Silas's face twisted, but he saw the rifles behind the words, the eyes of the people, the iron in Ezekiel's stare. He said nothing. He turned. As he left, the church erupted not in chaos, but in joy. It started with a cheer from the blacksmith's boy, then spread like wildfire. People clapped, some cried openly. Mabel wept behind her handkerchief. The school teacher grinned like a boy again. Even Mayor Gilroy smiled, relief washing through his pinched features. Clara leaned against Ezekiel's side, her hand catching his for just a moment. He didn't say a word, but he gave it a gentle squeeze. The threat was gone. The shadow lifted, and in the place where fear had stood, something stronger began to bloom: trust. Spring came like a long-held breath finally released. The last patches of snow melted into the earth, and the streams, once locked in ice, now sang through the valley with a voice that had been waiting months to speak. The trees unfurled their green, and the meadows below the ridge softened with new life. Where silence had ruled for so long, now birds returned, filling the early morning with song and rustling wings. The mountain thawed, not just in soil, but in spirit. Clara knelt in the patch of earth beside the cabin, hands deep in dirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her fingernails were lined with soil, and her cheeks, once pale and drawn, were now touched with color. She moved with care, setting beans into the shallow furrows she'd carved with a spoon and a bit of broken tin. Ezekiel had offered to build her proper tools, but she'd shaken her head. These would do. Her mother had always said it wasn't the tools that mattered, but the hands behind them. The garden had started with just a few rows, carrots, beans, onions, but Clara had plans. She'd drawn them in her sketchbook all winter, tucked between pages of foxes and wildflowers. A little fence to keep the deer out, a scarecrow with buttons for eyes, maybe sunflowers come summer. Up the hill, Ezekiel worked with hammer and nails, fitting planks together beneath the wide pine near the trailhead. He was building benches, simple, sturdy ones, to be hauled down into town for the new schoolhouse being raised near the church. The idea hadn't been his, but when Clara suggested it, when she said the children deserved a place to sit where they could dream, he'd nodded and gotten to work. He didn't say much, but every swing of the hammer carried something sacred, repentance maybe, or hope, or simply the quiet pride of building something that would last. The two boys came on a Thursday morning, escorted by the marshal and a letter from the judge. Their names were Jacob and Eli brothers, barely a year apart, left behind by one of Silas's hired men who had run when the judge laid down the law. Their father had vanished into the hills, leaving the boys with no name to claim and nowhere to go. They stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a satchel between them and staring at the ground. Clara met them there, her dress still damp from watering the garden, her hands streaked with mud. She didn't ask their story. She didn't need to. She simply stepped aside and said, "You're home now." That night, Ezekiel sat by the fire, whittling a toy horse from a block of pine. The boys were asleep in the loft above, curled beneath the quilts Ruthie had once sewn. Clara sat by the window, sketching them from memory, two heads bowed together, legs swinging from the porch rail, hope tucked into the corners of their eyes. Neither she nor Ezekiel spoke, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of grief or guardedness. It was peace. Outside, the seedlings stretched toward the sun, and inside, the walls of the old cabin, once built to house sorrow, now held the weight of something deeper. A family, imperfect and new, but chosen all the same. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long amber light across the ridge, the kind that made everything it touched seem golden and still. The garden was in bloom now, rows of beans curling up twine, onions thick in the soil, and Clara's sunflowers standing tall, their faces turned toward the heavens like they were listening for something. The cabin windows were thrown open, letting in the warm breeze, the scent of pine and damp earth drifting through the rooms like a hymn. Inside, Clara stood at the far end of the main room, brush in hand, smock streaked with color. She stepped back from the canvas she'd been working on for weeks, tilting her head, the way her mother once had when judging the shape of rising dough. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of what she'd captured. It wasn't just a painting. It was a memory stitched with care, a declaration of something that once seemed impossible. Ezekiel stood at the center, one hand resting on the fox kit now grown, still limping, still loyal, his other arm loosely around Clara's shoulder. His eyes, often hard, were soft in the image, not smiling but steady. Beside them, Jacob and Eli stood close, each boy holding something, a carved horse, a sketchbook, tokens of a life remade from the scraps of abandonment. Behind them, the ridge towered, and the garden bloomed at their feet. Clara stepped closer and dipped the brush once more, signing her name in small, curling script in the bottom right corner. Not hidden, not shy, just proud. When she turned, Ezekiel was watching her from the doorway, arms crossed, brow knit the way it always was when emotion sat too close to the surface. "You captured the fox's eyes perfect," he said, nodding toward the painting. She smiled softly. "Yours too." He stepped inside, his boots thudding against the wood. The fire had gone to embers, and the boys were out near the trees, chasing each other with wooden swords they'd carved from old fence posts. The laughter echoed faint, distant. Ezekiel looked at the painting for a long moment, then turned to her. His voice was rough, quieter than usual. "I reckon we done right." Clara said nothing at first. She just stepped beside him, shoulder brushing his, and looked up at the life they had made, not with plans or blood or gold, but with a kind of steadfast grace the world rarely noticed. Out on the porch, the sun dipped further, brushing everything in the warmth of a day's honest end. The garden rustled, the fox stirred, and the boys' laughter carried on the breeze. Some legacies are written in names, etched into stone, passed down in ledger books and family crests. But others, truer ones, are built in quiet deeds, in hands that heal instead of harm, in eyes that see worth where others saw burden. They are formed in cabins, on forgotten ridges, where a broken man and a discarded girl dared to become something whole. A dynasty doesn't need crowns or titles. Sometimes all it needs is a choice and a fire that never goes out. Stories like this matter, stories where good wins, where kindness holds the line, where the overlooked rise and love rebuilds. If this one stirred your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe and share your light. We'll keep telling these stories until every heart that needs them feels seen.